How lucky am I? Summary and analysis. Christian Watson's lessons on life, loss, gratitude, and mortality. Life, death, love, and letting go. How Lucky Am I is a 128-page illustrated book by American animator and designer Christian Watson, built around his popular character, Mr. Skelly. The book sits somewhere between visual storytelling, philosophy, self-help, illustrated nonfiction, and an adult picture book. That mixture matters. Treating it like a conventional self-improvement manual misses half of its purpose. Because Watson does not construct his message through studies, productivity frameworks, or numbered rules. He uses images, short reflections, emotional contrasts, and the movement of one deliberately simple character through an uncertain world. The approach follows the purpose set out for this summary, reconstructing what the book is saying, how its ideas connect, what they mean, where they succeed, and where their limits lie, rather than reducing it to a collection of motivational quotes. The big idea of the book. The central idea of how lucky am I can be expressed simply. The fact that life ends does not make life less valuable. It is one of the main reasons life has value at all. Watson repeatedly takes experiences that people instinctively classify as undesirable, uncertainty, failure, grief, disappointment, change, aging, and mortality, and changes the frame around them. The book does not argue that suffering is secretly pleasant. It argues something subtler. Loss proves there was something capable of being loved. Failure proves there was something worth attempting. Grief proves attachment existed. Uncertainty means the future remains open. Mortality means the ordinary moments currently available to us are finite rather than infinitely replaceable. Gratitude, therefore, becomes more than saying thank you for pleasant circumstances. It becomes a way of interpreting existence. That distinction is the engine of the entire book. The argument in one flow. Mr. Skelly begins with a paradox. Christian Watson could have chosen almost any character to represent gratitude. Instead, he chose a skeleton. Visually, Mr. Skelly carries an unavoidable association with death, yet he behaves with tenderness, curiosity, and vulnerability rather than menace. The character turns one of humanity's oldest symbols of mortality into something strangely reassuring. That transformation contains Watson's philosophy in miniature. Death is frightening partly because people mentally exile it from normal life. We behave as though living and dying belong to completely separate categories. Life is happening now, while death is an interruption that belongs somewhere far away. Mr. Skelly collapses that division. He is mortality walking through life. He camps, he wanders, he observes landscapes, he works, he rests, he encounters hardship, he seeks belonging. The symbol of death is therefore placed inside ordinary existence rather than outside it. Watson has explained that one purpose behind Mr. Skelly was essentially to make death less frightening, not to romanticize it or seek it, but to accept its inevitability sufficiently that awareness of death makes present life richer. That is considerably more interesting than generic positivity. The book begins from an uncomfortable fact rather than trying to suppress one. You are temporary. So is everyone you love. Many things you currently possess will disappear. Some ambitions will fail. Some relationships will change. Certain plans will never happen. There are circumstances you will not control. And you still have a life to live. The question becomes what you do with that information. Gratitude is reframed as attention. Ordinary gratitude advice often begins with inventory. List 5 things you appreciate. Think positively. Focus on what is going well. Watson's version goes deeper, because gratitude is primarily presented as a way of seeing. A person can possess enormous advantages and barely experience them because familiarity makes them invisible. A home becomes background, friendship becomes expected. A functioning body becomes unremarkable. Mourning becomes routine. Food becomes merely food. A conversation becomes another conversation. Time becomes something to kill. Only when one of these things disappears does its former value become obvious. How Lucky Am I tries to reverse that sequence. Instead of needing deprivation to recognize abundance, Watson asks whether attention can make value visible before loss performs the same job brutally. That explains why the artwork matters so much. The landscapes, quiet domestic environments, and small activities are not decorative additions to a written self-help argument. They demonstrate the argument. Readers are repeatedly encouraged to linger, to notice, to experience a scene rather than race through it. Reviews have highlighted precisely this quality. The illustrations carry substantial emotional weight, while the book's pacing and imagery make it feel designed to be revisited rather than consumed once and discarded. This produces an elegant relationship between form and message. A book telling you to slow down is itself constructed to slow you down. Control is smaller than we pretend. Another major strand concerns control. Human beings constantly behave as though enough planning can create certainty. Choose correctly. Work hard enough. Predict every possibility. Avoid every mistake. Secure the relationship. Build the career. Protect the money. Control the outcome. Life repeatedly refuses that bargain. Illness appears. Other people make decisions. Jobs disappear. Relationships end. Luck intervenes. Plans fail. Circumstances change. Time continues regardless. Watson does not recommend passivity in response. The useful distinction is between influence over action and ownership of outcomes. You can decide whether to attempt something. You cannot guarantee success. You can choose how you treat someone. You cannot control whether they remain. You can prepare carefully. You cannot eliminate chance. You can invest in health. You cannot negotiate immortality. Accepting that distinction initially sounds like surrender. In practice, it can be liberating. A huge amount of unnecessary suffering comes from demanding certainty in areas where certainty cannot exist. Mr. Skelly's movement through changing terrain works as a visual version of this principle. The environment changes, difficulty appears, beauty appears, movement continues. The challenge is not to command every landscape. It is to remain capable of living while the landscape changes. Failure becomes evidence of participation. One of the strongest implications of Watson's philosophy concerns failure. Modern self-help frequently tries to make failure palatable by claiming it will eventually produce success. Fail now so that you win later. Learn the lesson. Come back stronger. Everything happened for a reason. Watson's framework does not require that bargain. Failure can remain failure. Something can hurt without later revealing itself as a disguised gift. The more defensible insight is that having the opportunity to try it all is part of being alive. This changes the question. Instead of, did I get what I wanted? It becomes, was it worth being somebody capable of wanting, attempting, and experiencing this? That does not eliminate disappointment. It prevents disappointment from becoming a verdict on existence. A failed ambition does not prove the attempt was worthless. An ended relationship does not retroactively erase every meaningful moment within it. An abandoned plan does not mean the years surrounding it were wasted. This is one reason the book's philosophy can feel comforting without requiring magical thinking. Life is not promised to arrange itself conveniently. Meaning has to survive that fact, losing what you wanted. The emotional center of How Lucky Am I is the relationship between loss and perspective. One of the book's defining ideas is contained in its suggestion that losing what you wanted may create room to recognize something better suited to you. That thought can be interpreted badly. Taken lazily, it becomes destiny talk. Every rejection was meant to happen. Every disaster secretly occurred for your benefit. The universe has something better planned. The book is more useful when read differently. Loss destroys certainty. And certainty can sometimes be the thing keeping us attached to an unsuitable future. People become committed not merely to what exists, but to imagined outcomes. The promotion that must happen. The person who must stay. The house they must eventually own. The identity they are supposed to become. The age by which life must look a certain way. Once a desired outcome becomes psychologically mandatory, anything else feels like failure. Losing that future can therefore feel like losing part of yourself. Watson invites the reader to ask whether the disappearance of one imagined life necessarily means the remaining life is inferior. Sometimes the answer is yes. Genuine tragedies should not be euphemized. Sometimes, however, the answer is no. A person may discover that what they desperately wanted was merely familiar, or prestigious, or socially approved, or attached to an earlier version of themselves. The loss hurts before its meaning becomes clear. That is different from pretending it never hurt. Grief and gratitude are allowed to coexist. Perhaps the book's most mature idea is that gratitude does not require the cancellation of grief. Those emotions can occupy the same psychological space. You can miss somebody and be grateful they existed. You can mourn an old life while recognizing possibilities in the new one. You can wish something had continued while accepting that it has ended. You can regard an experience as painful without wishing you had never experienced it. That is a much more resilient form of gratitude than forced positivity. Forced positivity says, don't feel bad because things could be worse. Watson's philosophy is closer to, feel what happened fully, then notice what its existence tells you about what mattered. Grief becomes evidence of attachment. The alternative to grieving somebody you loved would have been never loving them sufficiently to grieve. That does not make bereavement pleasant. It explains why pain and value are often inseparable. You cannot design a meaningful life from which loss has been completely removed, because many of the things that create meaning are precisely the things whose disappearance would hurt. Love creates vulnerability. Belonging creates vulnerability. Ambition creates vulnerability. Hope creates vulnerability. Attachment creates vulnerability. A perfectly protected life would also be an emotionally anesthetized one. Why Mr. Skelly had to be a skeleton? The choice of a skeleton is not merely branding. Strip a person down to bones and many of society's categories disappear. Designer clothes disappear. Beauty standards disappear. Money becomes invisible. Occupation disappears. Follower count disappears. Status symbols disappear. Most signals of class vanish. A skeleton cannot visibly advertise a successful career or fashionable lifestyle. This allows Watson to make another argument. Much of what humans fight to differentiate themselves through is remarkably superficial compared with what they share. Bodies fail. People want love. People fear loss. People seek safety. Everybody experiences time. Everybody eventually dies. The skeleton, therefore, becomes democratic. Mortality levels status. That is why the book's recurring idea that humanity is fundamentally composed of the same bones is more than a cute visual observation. It attacks the illusion that the external hierarchy through which people measure themselves represents the deepest level of human identity. It does not. Status matters socially. Money matters practically. Beauty changes how people are treated. Achievement can transform a life. Watson does not need to deny any of those realities for the skeleton metaphor to work. He only needs to show that none of them solves the fundamental human condition. The billionaire and the unknown worker remain temporary. The admired person can still be lonely. The professionally successful person can still waste their attention. The beautiful person still ages. The socially powerful person cannot buy yesterday. Once that is recognized, priorities become harder to evade. Time is the book's real currency. Underneath the discussion of gratitude, grief and death sits another subject: time. Almost every value in the book becomes sharper when translated into units of time. Relationships require time. Attention is time. Work consumes time. Regret concerns past time. Anxiety often colonizes future time. Presence determines how much current time is actually experienced. Mortality establishes the total amount of available time. The central mistake Watson challenges is behaving as though time were renewable. Money can often be regained. Status can change. Careers can restart. Possessions can be replaced. A Tuesday afternoon cannot be returned. A year spent obsessing over somebody else's opinion is gone. An evening with somebody you love eventually becomes a memory. That creates a brutal but useful hierarchy. The question is not simply whether something matters. It is whether it deserves the portion of your finite life that you are exchanging for it. That is why mortality, paradoxically, becomes a tool for decision-making. Remembering death can strip nonsense of some of its power. Is this argument worth another week of mental energy? Does this status competition deserve years? Do I actually want the life attached to this ambition? Am I postponing something meaningful because I assume there will always be another opportunity? Would I notice how fortunate this moment was only after it disappeared? These questions turn the book from comforting illustration into philosophy. The search for home. Mr. Skelly's journey is framed by movement towards family and a safe home. Penguin's official description explicitly makes that search part of the narrative structure. Home, therefore, means more than a building. It represents belonging, safety, recognition, connection, the place where movement no longer feels entirely aimless. That goal is significant because How Lucky Am I does not advocate detached individualism. Its answer to mortality is not personal optimization. It is relationship. The awareness that life is finite makes other people more valuable, not less. If nothing lasts, then presence becomes precious. If nobody lasts, affection becomes urgent. A meaningful life is not created solely by accumulating memorable experiences for oneself. Its richness also comes from being connected to people whose existence changes the texture of ordinary time. The Search for Family gives the book's philosophy somewhere concrete to land. Gratitude without attachment could become abstract mindfulness. Mortality without attachment could become nihilism. Belonging prevents both. Life matters partly because somebody else is in it. Mortality without nihilism. Any serious reflection on death eventually confronts nihilism. If everything ends, why does anything matter? Watson effectively reverses the premise. Things matter because they end. Imagine a sunset that remained permanently fixed in the sky. Eventually it would stop being a sunset and simply become the background. Imagine unlimited days. There would be no urgency to use this one. Imagine relationships guaranteed never to change. Attention could always be postponed. Scarcity gives moments contour. This is not a logical proof of objective meaning. How Lucky Am I is not attempting to settle philosophy's oldest metaphysical arguments. It offers something more practical. Even if permanence is impossible, experience remains real while it exists. A meal does not become worthless because it ends. Music does not fail because the song finishes. Childhood is not meaningless because adulthood replaces it. A relationship need not last forever to have mattered. A life need not be infinite to contain value. That is Watson's quiet rejection of nihilism. Impermanence does not erase meaning. It creates the conditions under which much human meaning becomes visible. The most important ideas inside the argument. Attention determines how much life you actually experience. Two people can possess similar circumstances and experience them radically differently. One remains psychologically elsewhere, reviewing yesterday, anticipating tomorrow, comparing today with what it supposedly should have been. The other notices what is present. The external quantity of time may be identical. The experienced quality of that time is not. Watson repeatedly draws the reader towards the ordinary because ordinary life constitutes most life. If happiness depends exclusively on exceptional events, most days automatically become filler. The holiday matters. The promotion matters. The wedding matters. The achievement matters. Everything between them becomes waiting. How Lucky Am I challenges that model. A worthwhile life cannot consist entirely of highlights because highlights are rare by definition. Meaning therefore has to become available on ordinary days. Acceptance is not the same as approval. People often resist acceptance because they think accepting reality means endorsing it. It does not. You can accept that something happened while believing it was unfair. You can accept that somebody left without deciding their behavior was acceptable. You can accept mortality without liking death. You can recognize uncertainty without abandoning planning. Acceptance merely stops reality from having to win the same argument with you every morning. That matters because the refusal to accept an irreversible fact does not reverse it. It only consumes more life. Watson's emphasis on letting go, therefore, works best not as passive resignation, but as refusing to pay ongoing attention to battles reality has already settled. Gratitude includes what was temporary. A common version of gratitude focuses on possession. I am grateful to have this. Watson expands the category. I can be grateful to have had this. That tiny grammatical shift matters enormously. If gratitude is available only for things still possessed, then every loss removes a source of value. If gratitude can survive possession, the past can remain meaningful without requiring its restoration. This offers one of the book's strongest responses to grief and change. You do not need everything beautiful to remain in order for it to have been beautiful. The strongest section. The strongest conceptual territory in How Lucky Am I is Watson's attempt to reconcile mortality with gratitude. The skeleton makes the argument visually before the text has to explain it. We typically use skeleton imagery to communicate danger, horror, death, or decay. Watson turns that visual vocabulary inside out. Mr. Skelly is gentle. The environments can be beautiful. His vulnerability feels recognizable. Death and warmth occupy the same frame. This prevents mortality from remaining theoretical. A conventional self-help author could write hundreds of pages about appreciating finite time and still fail to produce an image as immediate as a small skeleton quietly participating in everyday life. The device also works across age and background. There is almost nothing culturally complicated about understanding a skeleton. Everybody knows what it represents. Watson then asks readers to reconsider what that representation should make them feel. Not excitement about dying. Not indifference. Not horror alone. Awareness. The weakest section of the argument. The same simplicity that gives How Lucky Am I emotional accessibility also limits its philosophical reach. Some forms of suffering cannot be meaningfully reframed by attention. Poverty is not primarily a perspective problem. Abuse is not solved through gratitude. Serious illness cannot be reduced to mindset. Structural injustice remains structural even when the individual experiencing it becomes psychologically resilient. A reader who universalizes Watson's philosophy too aggressively could therefore produce an unpleasant conclusion. If someone remains unhappy, perhaps they simply have not learned to appreciate life properly. That would be a misuse of the book. Gratitude changes a person's relationship with circumstances. It does not automatically change the circumstances. Acceptance may reduce futile suffering. It does not remove the need to resist preventable harm. Perspective is powerful precisely because it is one dimension of life, not because it explains everything. The book works much better as a corrective to chronic dissatisfaction than as a universal theory of suffering. What the book proves. Strictly speaking, How Lucky Am I does not prove propositions in the academic sense. It does something different. It demonstrates how changing perspective can change the emotional meaning of familiar experiences. A skeleton can become comforting. Loss can coexist with gratitude. Mortality can create urgency without creating panic. Ordinary moments can acquire significance once their scarcity becomes visible. Failure can remain disappointing without becoming meaningless. These are experiential claims rather than scientific ones. Watson's success depends on whether the reader recognizes something true in them. For many readers, the recognition seems strong. The book rapidly became an instant #1 bestseller in both the US and UK according to Penguin's publisher pages, suggesting Mr. Skelly's existing audience translated into substantial demand for the longer-form work. What the book does not prove. The book does not demonstrate that everything happens for a reason. It does not prove suffering makes people stronger. It does not establish that losing something guarantees something better will replace it. It does not prove gratitude cures psychological distress. It does not show that external circumstances are irrelevant. And it certainly does not establish that death itself is good. Those conclusions go further than Watson needs to go. The stronger and more defensible argument is simply that mortality changes the value of time, and perspective changes how much of that value we recognize. That is enough. What most summaries miss. The easiest way to summarize How Lucky Am I is: be grateful for what you have. That is also the least interesting interpretation. Watson's deeper argument is about scarcity. Why appreciate today? Because there are not infinitely many todays. Why appreciate people? Because neither they nor you are permanent. Why tolerate uncertainty? Because control was never absolute. Why survive disappointment? Because one failed future is not identical to the failure of your life. Why notice ordinary things? Because ordinary things form the majority of existence. Gratitude is therefore the visible surface of the book. Mortality is the machinery underneath it. What most people misunderstand. Another shallow reading would treat Mr. Skelly as a cute vehicle for positive thinking. But positive thinking usually attempts to replace negative interpretation with optimistic interpretation. Watson's stronger moments do not require optimism. Death remains death. Loss remains loss. Failure remains failure. Uncertainty remains uncertainty. What changes is the conclusion drawn from those facts. A person can know that life is fragile and still participate enthusiastically. They can know relationships may end and still love. They can know projects may fail and still attempt them. They can know happiness will not be continuous and still regard existence as worthwhile. That is not optimism in the childish sense. It is closer to acceptance, the tailored interpretation. The most interesting way to read How Lucky Am I is as a book about psychological accounting. People are excellent at measuring what is missing: the salary they have not reached, the partner they do not have. The body they have not built, the recognition they did not receive, the house they cannot afford, the future they thought they would have by now. Our mental balance sheet can become dominated by absence. Watson changes the accounting method. Instead of only asking what remains unpaid, he asks what has already been received. Another morning. The person you once loved. The chance to start again. The experience hidden inside a failed attempt. A body capable of carrying you this far. A landscape. A meal. A home. A conversation. Another ordinary afternoon. Mortality makes that recalculation unavoidable, because eventually every account closes. Mr. Skelly therefore represents the balance sheet after status has been removed. What was actually valuable? Not what looked impressive, not what produced comparison, not what made strangers jealous. What was worth spending finite time on? That is the question lurking underneath the drawings. Why this book matters now? How lucky am I arrived in 2026? Into an environment almost perfectly designed to make people feel that ordinary existence is inadequate. Social media industrializes comparison. Algorithms expose people to exceptional beauty, wealth, achievement, travel, and success throughout the day. A normal life is compared not with another normal life, but with a curated compilation of everyone else's highlights. The result can be a strange form of abundance blindness. A person can be safe, fed, entertained, connected, and surrounded by technologies previous generations could barely imagine, while simultaneously feeling as though life has not properly begun. Watson's answer is deliberately unfashionable. Look again. Not because ambition is wrong, because ambition without attention creates an absurd outcome. You can spend your entire life building a future that, once reached, you are psychologically incapable of noticing. The person who cannot value today may discover that tomorrow suffers from exactly the same defect. There will always be another comparison, another target, another person ahead, another missing thing. Gratitude interrupts that infinite postponement. If you only remember 3 ideas. 1. Mortality is not separate from the value of life. Knowing that time ends is frightening, but endless time would remove much of the urgency that makes attention meaningful. Scarcity is not merely life's tragedy, it is part of its value. 2. Losing something does not mean it was worthless. Grief, disappointment, and endings do not erase what preceded them. Something temporary can still have mattered enormously. The correct response to impermanence is not necessarily detachment. Sometimes it is deeper appreciation while something remains. 3. Your life is mostly ordinary days. If meaning is postponed until extraordinary circumstances arrive, most existence becomes waiting. A successful life, therefore, requires learning how to recognize value in routine experiences rather than demanding constant intensity. The sentence that explains the book. Life becomes richer when you stop treating its temporary nature as evidence that nothing matters and start recognizing it as the reason your time matters so much. The real life test. The philosophy becomes useful when placed against actual decisions. Imagine someone obsessing over a career setback. The simplistic response is, be grateful you have a job. Watson's better test would be, can this situation still be changed? If yes, act. If no, what amount of finite attention does replaying it deserve? Then ask what remains available despite the setback. Relationships? Health? Skills? Another attempt? Time? An alternative direction? The same approach applies to relationships. Someone may spend years psychologically living inside a future that no longer exists. Acceptance does not mean the relationship did not matter. It means recognizing that a meaningful past is not automatically an instruction to sacrifice the present. With status, the test becomes sharper. Suppose you achieve something largely because you want other people to recognize that you achieved it. How long does the satisfaction survive? Hours? Days? Then another comparison appears. Watson's skeleton poses an uncomfortable question to every status game. When the external signals are removed, was the underlying activity worth your life? Sometimes the answer will still be yes. Building a company may be thrilling. Mastering a profession may be deeply satisfying. Winning can matter. Ambition is not the enemy. Unconscious ambition is. The goal is not to become indifferent to achievement. It is to ensure achievement serves life, instead of endlessly postponing it. 5 questions to test whether you understood the book. 1. Why is Mr. Skelly a more effective character than an ordinary human narrator? Because his visible mortality removes many superficial differences between people while placing death inside everyday life, rather than treating it as an external interruption. 2. Does Watson argue that loss is good? No. The stronger argument is that loss does not erase previous value, and that learning to coexist with impermanence can prevent grief from turning into a rejection of life itself. 3. What is the difference between gratitude and forced positivity? Forced positivity denies or minimizes painful reality. Gratitude can acknowledge pain completely while simultaneously recognizing what remains valuable. 4. Why does the book focus so heavily on ordinary moments? Because ordinary moments constitute most of a human life. A philosophy that can find meaning only in exceptional experiences condemns most existence to irrelevance. 5. What is the practical value of remembering mortality? It clarifies priorities. Limited time forces a harder question about where attention, energy, love, and effort deserve to be spent. The final lesson. How lucky am I looks gentle because it is gentle. That does not mean its argument is soft. Christian Watson places death beside the reader and refuses to pretend it is going away. Everything you are building is temporary. Everyone you love is temporary. The version of you reading this is temporary. Some dreams will happen. Others will collapse. People will arrive and leave. You will lose things you once believed you could not live without. The clock continues regardless. Faced with that reality, there are two obvious reactions. One is nihilism. Nothing lasts, therefore nothing matters. Watson offers the opposite. Nothing lasts. Therefore pay attention. There will not be another first version of this day. There will not be another childhood. There will not be an unlimited number of dinners with the people currently sitting around your table. There is no warehouse containing spare years that can later replace those surrendered to resentment, comparison, or fear. This does not mean living with frantic urgency. It means refusing to require permanence before something is allowed to matter. A flower can die and still have been beautiful. A relationship can end and still have contained love. A plan can fail and still have produced experience. A person can grieve and still be fortunate to have had something worth grieving. A life can end and still have been a good life. That is why Mr. Skelly works. He carries the ending visibly everywhere he goes. And instead of making the world look empty, that knowledge makes the landscape more vivid. The deeper question behind how lucky am I is therefore not whether you possess enough reasons to feel fortunate. Most people probably possess some and lack others. The question is whether you can recognize value while it is still present, rather than discovering its importance only through its disappearance. That is a much harder skill. It may also be one of the most valuable, because someday the ordinary day you barely noticed will turn out to have been one of the days you would give almost anything to experience again. The point is to notice it before then.